So I'm going to turn this over to David Axelrod. He will be both moderating and fully participating in the panel, and that I don't know if they're applauding. I don't know if they're applauding your arrival or my departure. I wasn't. In any event, I'm assuming it's your arrival. I've known David for a long time. All of you know who he is and what he brings to what he's graciously agreed to do here today. And we're going to shift, although it's been very difficult, of course, always to keep the political out of the governance discussion, but now focus very much on the politics of the midterms, the application of the midterms for 2020. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the questions that you gave me that have very strong interests expressed in political issues, I've turned over to David, and he'll weave that in either in the course of things or toward the end. So with that, David, I turn it over to you. And you can have the mic.
Some people just can't give it up. First of all, I want to say I'm very happy to be here. Bob was a great colleague, both in the White House and the campaign. He was the guy who actually told me that one has to sell one's businesses before they go to work in the White House to avoid conflicts of interest. That's how long ago. That's how long ago it was. I also want to thank Sidley because Sidley and Austin has provided for the last 20 years pro bono legal assistance to an organization called Citizens United for Research in Epilepsy, which my wife founded because we have a daughter who's profoundly impacted by epilepsy, and I can't even put a price tag on the amount of hours that have been donated to us. Now, these guys haven't been introduced yet, right? Right. Okay. Hi, guys. Hi. So, right here we have Ron Klain, who's the Executive Vice President, General Counsel of Revolution, though he does many other things that we will talk about during the course of this discussion. And Ron, of course, has been Chief of Staff to 2 Vice Presidents and played a variety of roles in government and in politics, and is really one of the smartest people that I've ever worked with. So it's a pleasure to see you again. Emily Eakins is the Director of Polling at the Cato Institute. And I'm told that you're also one of the smartest people that I've ever worked with. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. And Doug Thornell from SKD Knickerbocker, Managing Director. There is a veteran of many campaigns and various roles in Democratic Party organizations, and was most recently, you were mentioning before we came out here, down in Florida for that governor's race with Andrew Gillum. So I think there'll be plenty of interest in that. Oh, you were taking a picture. I thought there were some Andrew Gillum fans here. But let me just begin by asking you guys your sort of top line political assessment of the midterms and what they mean, what you learned.
Well, I'd say a couple things. One, I think that everything that we saw that happened in 2016, everything that we thought we knew about politics, happened with even greater intensity. If you took the 2016 electoral map and put it on your iPhone and dialed the brightness up 2 more notches, that's what 2018 looked like. Democrats did better in 2018 because some of those areas that had been blue hadn't been that intense in 2016. Our intensity went up. Republican intensity was already quite high in 2016. It didn't have that much more up to go, and so we gained significantly in the areas where we needed to gain. We flipped a bunch of 40 congressional seats and some key governorships and so on and so forth. But overall, the country didn't change very much. Overall, just the blue places got a lot bluer, the red places stayed pretty red. And and I think that's a pretty significant thing about where our country is politically. It's divided, it's tribal, those 2 sides are pretty hard-baked, they're not moving that much. The intensity kind of goes up or down a little bit, and that has a huge impact on electoral outcomes, but you're not seeing much of things changing. Other thing I'd say is, I think it just reconfirmed my conviction that Donald Trump is the political figure in my lifetime that has the highest floor and the lowest ceiling of any political figure you can imagine. It's not an exaggeration when he says he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose any supporters of his 38 or 39%. And it's also kind of
test the proposition.
yeah, I mean, probably will by the end of the week. But it's also not. But it's also I, as David said, I worked 5 different jobs, 2 White Houses over 10 years, and I would have liked to know what it would be like to walk in the White House one day with 4% unemployment and a stock market at 25,000. I never had that experience. For President Trump to have those numbers and do as badly as he did just shows there's a huge chunk of the country that is not going to accept him, not going to support him, no matter what some of the objective indicators are. So, I think that's a reality. I think the tribalization is a reality, and we're at a time of, really varying intensity between the 2 tribes and their political participation.
Emily, go ahead, but I want to just lead you into your piece, because I know you studied demographics very closely. Ron said basically this was a dial-up of what we saw in 2016, but an area that was neither red nor blue particularly, but used to be red were the suburbs, and what happened there seemed startling, particularly among women, and so I ask you to address that as part of your answer.
I'm so glad you asked that question, David, because that's exactly where I was going. Because when you were talking about dialing it up, I actually had a slightly different perspective, which was that what was interesting were some of those red districts that went blue. And those red districts that went blue were often those suburbs. California, if you look at the suburbs in California that had traditionally voted Republican, they just got wiped out. One Republican political consultant put it to me this way. He said, it may not have been a blue tsunami at the national level, but in California, it was a blue tsunami for us. That's what he said. I think that a lot of time after the 2016 election was spent on looking at the Obama to Trump voters. These are individuals who voted for Barack Obama in 2012, but then switched to Donald Trump in 2016. Based on some of the analyses that we've done with the Democracy Fund Voter Study Group, where we've been surveying like 8,000 Americans every 6 months since the election, our analysis suggests that about 6 million people switched from Obama to Trump. But I thought another thing that we really should be paying attention to are the Romney voters that switched to Hillary Clinton or switched to a third-party candidate. Look at those voters. Now, I think 2018 was the election where we've really zeroed in on those voters, and they became magnified. Now, we actually have a survey in the field right now where we'll be able to measure exactly how many more voters that counted for. But we want to be looking at who are these voters that voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 and then switched over to Hillary Clinton or a third-party candidate or a Democratic candidate by 2018, and what really defines their voting behavior. And some of the analysis that we have done suggests that attitudes about immigration are the strongest predictors of the people that switch sides. And what that means is that when you look at what they think about taxes and spending and healthcare, these people actually look like traditional Republicans. But when you ask them about immigration attitudes, they don't really fit with the Donald Trump program on immigration, and so that they're exiting the party and voting for Democrats largely on immigration.
Let me ask you one question before I get on to Doug, and that is, you've done a lot of work on millennials, and there was a significant uptick in millennial participation this time. How significant, and what do you think that means with 2020 looming?
Well, I mean, certainly millennials were a very important part of the Obama coalition, and they didn't come out quite in the droves that people were hoping for, the Democrats were hoping for in 2016. In these midterms, their interest was way up, and according to the exit polls, 67% of them voted for the Democratic candidate for Congress. So I think that we're seeing more interest among young people. They're more excited and energized to vote. And I think part of the reason is that millennials grew up in an increasingly diverse world where they have many friends who are themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants. And this kind of policy regime and also the rhetoric that we hear coming from the Trump administration does not resonate with them, and as many find highly offensive, and so they're mobilized to vote.
We should point out in this regard that the millennial margin 4 years ago was 11 points for the Democrat. It was 19 in 2016, according to the exit polls. 35% this year, which is a significant shift. Doug, what are your observations?
Well, I first of all, I agree with a lot of what both Ron and Emily have said. For me, what strikes me as a Democrat watching all of these races unfold that I thought was interesting and actually promising for 2020 and beyond is the discipline that a lot of our candidates showed on issues that, particularly healthcare, that we knew were winning issues in a lot of these districts that were even red, but it required the Democrats to really commit to it. And I think for folks who've been involved in Democratic Party politics over the years, sometimes it's hard to get our candidates to really commit, to really demonstrate message discipline. And if you look at the advertising that was done throughout this cycle, I saw a study that showed that there was basically something like 300,000 ads that were run that were on healthcare by Democrats. And I know in Florida, a lot of the ads we ran were on healthcare and protecting folks with pre-existing conditions. And this was across the board in a lot of different districts and states. And we didn't fall into, I think, some of the traps that the president tried to lay for us, where we're sort of running after a bunch of shiny objects, right? We had a lot of candidates who were basically committed to this pathway, and it ended up benefiting them, and they didn't fall into rabbit holes. And so there's a lot of big, I think we can look at a lot of the numbers in terms of how we did in the suburbs, which are obviously great. I mean, the fact that Democrats now represent every district in our Orange County is, I think just unbelievable. You look at how well we did with women, I think 60% exit polling. The fact that we were basically at parity with seniors, that was really surprising. I felt like that was something that was going to be really important for Democrats even more important than what the generic spread was, how well we would do with seniors. I think a lot of that had to do with health care. But just from a strategic point of view, I was really impressed with the discipline that our candidates showed on delivering their message over and over again and not falling down rabbit holes that the president would try to set for them.
This point on seniors is interesting to me. There is this meme out there that Trump commands his base, that his base is as intense as ever, and that, but he's also turned these, as Ron said, these bluer areas even more blue. But the fact is that seniors have been a base for the Republican Party, and they didn't do as well with seniors. Even in rural areas, the margin in the exit polls, at least, were smaller than they had been in his race, and I think maybe even than 2014. Emily, what do you ascribe that to?
Well,
is it the healthcare issue?
I don't know. I actually think that would be really interesting to test. Was it more healthcare or was it more immigration? Because one study that was done in the state of Minnesota where they asked independent voters, which party do you agree with more? You might have expected them to say the Democratic Party, but the independent voters that were surveyed in the study said the Republicans. So I was surprised by that. I'd like to see a little bit more before I draw conclusions.
Because in these exit polls, independent voters supported Democrats by 12%.
Right.
They supported Trump by 4%.
Right. So what is, so if it's not that in particular, what's going on? And I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that historically, midterm elections, the president's party loses seats in midterm elections. That almost always happens. 2004 was, 2002 was an aberration from the norm. So we should expect the president's party to lose some seats. But what we wouldn't have expected is perhaps how many seats he lost, especially to your point, given how well the economy is doing.
Yeah, can I just build on something Emily said before? I think, what's really interesting to me is that our political system seems very dug in but also very unstable in one critical respect. So if you think about the country is divided into two tribes, we'll call one like the Whole Foods tribe and the other like the Dollar General store tribe, okay? And what happened in 2018 was the Whole Foods tribe really voted Democratic, right? In these districts that Emily was talking about that had been held by Republicans but still had been won by Hillary Clinton in 2016. They went the rest of the distance, elected a Democratic congressperson, went all the way blue, and the rural districts really performed for the Republicans, and that's why they won statewide in states like Ohio and Indiana and whatnot, okay? So two tribes. And they kind of map up a little bit to our two political parties. That's what makes our politics so entrenched. But they also really mismatch with the two political parties. And I think that's what makes our politics in some ways very unstable. As Emily said, if you look at that Whole Foods tribe, they're really reacting negatively to Trump's hateful, divisive, anti-immigration, divisive stuff. But they're not all in with the Democrats on big government and a lot of the things we would do if we were in charge, right? And if you look at the red tribe, the Dollar General store tribe, they're all in with Trump on the hate and the divisiveness and all that stuff. They're not that wild about what a completely rollover he is for big corporate interests and for the big tax breaks for the rich and for all this stuff. And so I think as you look ahead to 2020, if the choice is between kind of a traditional Democrat and traditional Republican and Trump, you're going to get a repeat of what we saw in 2018. But if that gets mixed up at all, if you get a third-party candidate in there, if Trump somehow disappears, the Republicans nominate someone, there's a lot of instability in what seems like these two very fixed camps that I think could change if the political options change.
Yep.
I think that I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, in particular, I would, I think the suburbs are a great example of that because, that has always been a bastion for the Republican Party. Higher income earners who had an affinity towards the party because of their economic policies, and we saw in 2018 that sort of end in many places, suburbs outside of Illinois, New Jersey, California, and so is that a Trump phenomenon because they just can't stomach sort of what he is saying, or is that a realignment that's occurring within our politics, or is it something different than that?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important question because every election you hear people talk about realignment, but realignment doesn't happen all that often. And the question is this a Trump phenomenon, or is there, because of the way we're sorting ourselves and cultural changes and so on, are metropolitan areas, including the suburbs, becoming a more reliable Democratic base? Trump or not?
So I think Trump accelerated a trend that was already happening. Starting in the 1990s, we started seeing people with college degrees starting to vote more Democratic. In the past, if someone had a college degree, chances were they voted Republican. And in the 90s, it started to shift a little bit. And now we're actually seeing people with college degrees voting Democratic. And what I think happened is that was already happening year upon year, just a little bit. And then Trump came in and accelerated that. So it's possible that if Trump weren't on the ticket, maybe that dials back just a little bit. But I think over the next 10 to 15 years, this is a trend that most likely will continue unless the parties change their positions on these very important cultural issues.
Yeah, I mean, if you were advising the Republic, first of all, we should point out that the biggest Democratic win since the Watergate year, and it happened not just in the midst of a good economy, but a incredibly well gerrymandered Republican map in most states, and so it makes the win even more astonishing. So I think that's an important thing to remember. But how do you think this all translates relative to 2020? I mean, let's talk geographically for a second and not demographically. One of the interesting things I think in this election has been that, was that the performance in the upper Midwest of Democratic candidates, Democratic governors elected in Michigan and Wisconsin, landslide victories for Democratic senator and governor in Pennsylvania, These are 3 states that helped deliver the presidency to Trump. Without them, he would not have had the 270 electoral votes that he needed. Florida, where you were, was obviously very, very close in both races, and it portends a very... But if you were sitting there planning strategy for Trump, I guess the question is, if we don't get these states, and I'm writing Ohio off for a second, if we don't get these states, where do we get the other electoral votes? And it's not obvious to me where he goes.
Right. I mean, I think that, again, absent some kind of untrumping of the Republican Party or drastic change in the Democratic Party, if 2020 looks like 2018 in terms of the lineup, then, I mean, if you own a television set in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, or Florida, you ought to turn the thing off and blow it up, because all you are going to see is TV ads. And this is like a big, I mean, you know, if you think about it, the point I think David's getting to is, when the first presidential campaign I worked on full time was the '92 campaign, we had a kind of a battleground that was like 12 or 13 states. And it seems like each campaign I've worked in since then, the battleground's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think in all practical purposes, we could sit here today and say basically the battleground in 2020 is Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, and Florida. And like those 5 states are gonna see a level of political activity unprecedented in modern times. Trump has to win them. The Democrats have to win them. Like, that's kind of the game. And like, I don't think the Democrats are going to play in Missouri or Ohio or some of these places we used to play. And I don't think the Republicans are going to mess around in Illinois or some of these other places. I mean, I think that's going to be it. And if you live in one of those 5 states, you are going to have like a presidential candidate living in your house for most of the year.
What an appetizing thought.
Indeed.
So, Doug, talk about Florida. And there was some great expectation that Democrat candidates, because of the polling in the final week, and Emily, you may want to jump in on what on polling and what we should take away from polling before elections and what we shouldn't. But tell me what you think about Florida going into 2020.
So I think I agree with Ron on most of those states. I actually would throw in Democrats need to protect Nevada and Colorado, and we also have a big Senate race in Colorado, so a pickup opportunity there too. So I'm not entirely sure if Florida would make my top 5 list. It might be in the top 6. It's very, but and then obviously Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, the president needs to defend. If he loses those 3 and loses Nevada, Colorado, he loses the White House, right?
So interesting, by the way, just parenthetically, to hear someone say a Republican president has to defend Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, right, which were
it shows
part of the blue wall,
right?
In the past.
Right. Florida is such a first of all, Florida is such an fascinating state to work in.
Yes, Ron had a lot of good experiences there.
Ron knows better than all of us. And we almost needed to call Ron down there again.
He still has PTSD from that.
Yeah, but first of all, it's got just many media markets, expensive state, campaigning there is hard, and it's really like 3 or 4 different types of states in one. You have a lot of people who have moved from the Midwest who moved to Florida. You've got people from New York who've moved to Florida. You've got the Panhandle, which is much more of a more southern-leaning area, and then you've got the southern part of the state, which is operates more like a Democratic state. So we walked. All of our polling, internal polling, private polling, and all the public polling had Gillum up a couple points. So basically, it was tied, right?
And Nelson.
And Nelson came on stronger towards the end. He was sort of trailing, I think, a little bit, certainly after the primary. But there were, I think there were a couple things that I think happened towards the end that ended up hurting us. First of all, I do think the president's visit down there did help a little bit in terms of galvanizing his support, because I think the Republican nominee for governor was just very lackluster. And I think what what Trump did was he sort of, he infused a little bit of his, if you want to call it magic, whatever you want to call it, into places in the state that needed to be woken up.
I'm sure he would agree with you.
I'm sure he would. And so he, in that respect, I think that was helpful. I do also think that the race became very racialized towards the end in terms of the Republicans did a good job. They started the race with their candidate talking about, we can't monkey this
Right.
up. There were a series of neo-Nazis making robocalls. Throughout the campaign, there were just a lot of dog whistles. And it's sort of, and I think, especially at the end of the campaign, it became more prominent. There was a very well, I think, publicized exchange during the debate between Gillum and DeSantis on race. And I think that created, I think that had an impact. You do the research, so I'm not entirely sure exactly what that did, but I think it may have. I think for some Republicans who were going to stay home because they weren't really too enamored with DeSantis and weren't really too thrilled with Trump, I think that may have gotten them out.
But the question is moving forward. I
Sure.
heard a statistic after the election that kind of shocked me, which was when we had invested a lot of effort in 2008 to increase voter registration all over the country. But in 2008, Democrats had a 750,000 vote or thereabouts registration edge in Florida. That number was closer to 250,000 in 2018, 10 years later. I think owing to efforts on the part of election authorities to shrink
Right.
that margin, not to impute bad motives to them, but
Right.
Well, I would add the one thing on that, which is why I'm a little more optimistic about Florida in 2020, which is one thing that did happen in 2018 in Florida
yeah.
was the passage of Question 4, which means that 1.4 million in a state that the Senate candidate lost by 10,000 votes, 1.4 million ex-felons will now be eligible to vote in Florida in 2020, and obviously not all those people will get registered, and not all of them will vote, but that is a significant new pool of potential voters, I think, does change the game. And the last thing I'd say is, I think Puerto Rican voters who moved to Florida after the hurricane, I think Governor Scott did a very good job of trying to persuade those voters to vote for him. I think it's hard to imagine a lot of those voters are going to vote for Donald Trump, throwing paper towels at him in 2020. So I do think Democrats have a good chance in Florida in 2020 for those two reasons.
And they made some really important gains just on early voting. That was something that Democrats had sort of trailed Republicans on in years past. We did a really phenomenal job with early voting. I think we won early voting for the first time in Florida ever. Now it hasn't been around that long, but that was a real promising thing. So, and I agree with you on making sure that we can expand the electorate more than and bring in more voters. The Hispanic vote in Florida is also very interesting to watch because it's not a base. They don't operate as base voters. They operate as persuasion voters, and Democrats need to understand that.
Yeah, and for years it was a Republican bastion because of the Cuban
Right.
Population down there. Emily, you talk about immigration as a motivator and I guess through regression analysis and so on, you've landed on that. How much did the president's campaigning help Republicans, and was there a point beyond which it didn't? And I'm thinking after the bomber was arrested, the guy who sent the bombs to all of the Democratic luminaries, and after the tragic shooting in Pittsburgh, the president seemed to take his rhetoric from a 10 to an 11, including introducing, and I know you've written about this, birthright citizenship and the removal of it and so on. But there was a very hard edge to his campaigning in the last week. I noticed in the exit polls by a 10-point margin, people said they decided in the last week, and there weren't that many of them, so I don't know how much to take from this voted Democratic. But what do you think the impact of his campaigning overall was and in the last week?
So it seems that there's two things that I'm thinking of here. One, it does seem like Donald Trump's campaigning helped certain candidates in certain races. An example of this being Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee. And it was almost that the candidates who did not jump on the Trump bandwagon early on seem to have been punished at the polls. It's hard to say this definitively, but Martha McSally in Arizona, she was definitely not on, kind of a big supporter of Trump at the beginning, and then she kind of almost had to pretend as though she was later on. Dean Heller in Nevada. So the candidates that were not on board with Trump kind of instinctively at the beginning seem to have not generated as much support among Republicans. And it seems like one of the reasons for that might be is that Republicans tend to see criticism of Donald Trump as being a sign of being disloyal to the group overall, which I think is very interesting. So Republicans that were able to kind of, stay out of that, where they were not criticizing him directly, but perhaps not getting a direct endorsement, were probably in the safest area. But aside from Trump, I think there's something else that was very important that played out with the Senate races that kind of was alluded to in Florida. Democratic senators who voted against the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh were disproportionately affected in the midterms this time around. In fact, they did worse than we would have expected. If you looked at the polling going into the election, we saw Claire McCaskill might be in trouble. Maybe Heidi Heitkamp might have also been in trouble, but we saw Tester in Montana almost lose. What we saw in Indiana and Florida as well.
Well, West Virginia Manchin was closer.
And he voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. So it seems like that was the other piece here, where it wasn't just Trump. That Republicans were not only may have been mobilized by Trump, but in particular were mobilized against Democrats in red states who voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh.
Yeah.
And in particular, the people who said that was very important to them, overwhelmingly in those states, voted for the Republican candidate.
Right.
Yeah, I just don't buy that. I mean, I think that John Tester was Donald Trump's #1 target. He voted against Kavanaugh.
Trump carried the state by 20 points.
Trump carried the state enormously, and Tester won. Look, I think in the end...
Barely. He underperformed his polls.
Right, and Joe Manchin, who voted for Kavanaugh, barely won. So... look, in the end, some senators who voted against Kavanaugh lost. They were also senators in deeply, deeply red states who faced opponents who were skillful opponents. And I worked very much on the Donnelly race, and I can tell you that, he lost. He lost because Indiana's a state that voted for Donald Trump by 20 points. Trump came in there a bunch of times. Braun was a cipher. He had nothing that really you could go after him on. And, the state rolled with Braun, and so in the end, I don't think the Kavanaugh thing helped the Republicans. I don't think it hurt the Democrats. I don't think it really moved the needle much one way or the other. I do think, though, it is this phenomenon that in these Republican states, these very Republican states, it was very hard for Democratic senators to win. Manchin pulled it off. Tester pulled it off. But I don't think it's a big surprise that McCaskill, Heitkamp, and Donnelly didn't. I think Florida was a special case. I mean, if you want to look at Florida, Nelson, who voted against Kavanaugh, obviously slightly outpolled Gillum, who didn't vote at all on Kavanaugh. So I mean, I don't think it's... Pardon me?
But Nelson did.
Yeah, and he did better than Gillum, who wasn't even. So I'm saying the general trend.
But he did worse than the polls had predicted. And
as did Gillum, who didn't vote on Kavanaugh at all. So I mean, I just think it's really hard to map this up against Kavanaugh. That's just,
so one reason we know that Kavanaugh had a major role in what happened in these red state Senate races, if you look at Marsha Blackburn, people expected her to lose to the Democratic candidate. This is the Bredesden, if I'm saying that properly. Taylor Swift endorsed him on Instagram and got a lot of attention. As soon as the end of September hits, all of a sudden Marsha Blackburn pulls ahead, and she never went back.
And Bredesen backed Kavanaugh. He endorsed Kavanaugh.
Well,
so it's hard to correlate it.
One thing I would say on Nevada and Arizona is that worse than being for or against Trump is probably being for and against Trump. And that, especially among independent voters, I wonder how that played. The the sort of insincerity of it to be firmly opposed than to become so dependent on him. McSally in particular had a primary in which she had to cleave very closely to Trump in order to be nominated, having been a never-Trumper back when he ran in 2016. One thing that I want to talk in a second about strategies for 2020, base versus outreach. But you said something that pollsters always say, and we always say it, the big bloviating talking heads say it, and that is we talk about college-educated voters versus non-college-educated voters. And I think there is a big cultural thing going on in this country, because when you say non-college-educated voters, I think that has a very pejorative implication oftentimes, even if it's not meant that way, this notion that these voters who aren't quite as educated as we are the base of Donald Trump's support. I wonder in certain ways if all of the commentariat, kind of like it's an unvirtuous cycle, because, and this you can just let that sit there for a second, because it leads into my fundamental point, which is there are two bodies of thought in both parties. Donald Trump's philosophy clearly is, I'm going to max out on my base. I may not grow it, I probably won't, but if I get enough of them out, especially with the Electoral College, I can prevail. To the extent that he has a rational view of this, that's, I think, what it is. For Democrats, there's this debate about should we maximize the base because there are more of us than them, and essentially write off people who voted for Trump and aren't likely to come, and really focus. And the argument would be, well, if Milwaukee had come out, if Detroit had come out in greater numbers, and so on, then we would have won those elections. Doug, just give me your view on, if you were advising the next Democratic campaign, how would you advise it?
So I don't think that, I think you can do both. And I think the Democratic, your old boss did both.
Yeah.
He was able to connect with working class whites and turn out a historic number of African Americans and win other people of color, Hispanics and Asians. So I don't think that it is, I don't think that I think the Democratic Party shouldn't fall into this trap where it's one or the other. We really need to be able to do both. And I
so
think
you're really coming down on one side of this discussion.
I think it starts with an
You gave a good political opening, but then you came down on one side of the...
I think it starts with going back to a solid economic set of ideas that I think if you look at the Democratic Party right now, we're really struggling with, except for infrastructure and talking about raising the minimum wage. We need more ideas out there that actually, I think, animate some of these voters who feel left behind and who felt talked to by Trump, and maybe just in strictly emotional terms, whether it was immigration or other ways that Trump has, was able to connect. I think Democrats can go back, can get those voters back. Now, there's some voters that are just now operating as Republicans, and they're just not going to. They're going to vote Republican, right? I think those Obama, Trump voters are people that we should certainly try to communicate with and bring back. The Obama, Romney, Trump voters, that's a little bit different story, and I think we should take a look at sort of how they, who they are, because I think those are different than folks who voted for the president twice and then moved to Trump. But I think Democrats would be making a mistake if they decided to just pick one or the other, because I think that's just a recipe for losing.
Ron, you've got your microphone cocked.
I do. I want to go back to this college thing, which I think is part of this, a big part of this, and say I think something we've done wrong, and something I've been wrong about for 20 years, and I also will lay this at the doorstep of our former boss, President Obama. President Obama used to famously say, what you earn will be based on what you learn. And we always thought of that as a very aspirational statement, a statement to encourage people, that we were going to have programs to send people to college and so on and so forth. And I think we have to face the fact that a lot of Americans heard that as an insult. And a lot of Americans heard that as us Democrats saying, look, if you don't go to college, we really don't have a plan for you. And you're going to have a kind of crappy life. And we really don't, we kind of think that's your fault, and we think you ought to go to college if you want to do something about it. And one of the Democratic candidates who ran in one of the most Republican districts, didn't win, Richard Ojeda in West Virginia, he ran on a campaign slogan. And his campaign slogan was, I don't want to have to get on an airplane to go see my grandchildren. And by that he meant that people in West Virginia should be able to live in West Virginia and build a good economic life in West Virginia and not have to go to MIT and move to Silicon Valley to make money. And I think, we have to, as
Tough
Democrats...
slogan to get on a poster, though.
Tough slogan to get on a poster, not successful. But I think it goes to the fact that we have to have a plan. Democrats have to have a plan that speaks to non-college educated voters. It doesn't speak down to them. It doesn't kind of say, basically, you got to go to college to have a middle-class life. And if we don't, we are just letting those voters become Republicans.
It's not, and beyond which it's not right. It's just not right. I mean, the fact of the matter is, and I'm very conscious of this now because I found myself talking about this stuff and I realized I sounded like Margaret Mead, talking about, the native population I was studying. And, people work hard. People work hard, and there's dignity in work. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a scholar or a Bob, forgive me, lawyer, or, there are people who bust their asses every day and deserve our respect. And the worthiness of what they do deserves our respect. And I think that we need to focus more on that, because one of the things Donald Trump has done is he's surfed that sense of disdain that people sense very, very effectively. And he became the tribune of people who felt like they were being disdained and discarded. Emily, what about Trump, though? What about Trump? No. What about this? I mean, it seems to me a risky strategy that he has assumed, which is, I'm the president of my base, and I'm going to speak relentlessly to it, because his base is limited. And it goes to this floor and ceiling issue that Ron spoke of. Can he get reelected absent a third-party candidate, which could be a play here for him to reduce his need to get, close to 50%? But can he win the presidency with that approach?
Oh. I think most people decided to get out of the business of prognostication after 2016.
I know, but unfortunately you're here.
Oh, I'm here. It's so hard to say. One thing that I think a lot of people forgot about in 2016, and this isn't that exciting, and people that work on campaigns are not going to like to hear this, but academics are able to model or predict election outcomes based on economic variables alone. So that would mean GDP growth, labor force participation rate, just kind of these indicators that seem really dry, and just economic variables. Nothing about who the candidates are.
We've got presidential races now. Because this last race, we got pretty good economic numbers. Didn't go very well for the incumbent party.
So if you go to, so there's an economist at Princeton, Ray Fair. He has a model that he will update every quarter. And going into 2016, based on those indicators alone, it predicted a Republican win. So throughout all of 2016, I was thinking, well, a Republican's most likely going to win no matter who it is, except there must be a floor somewhere, and Trump must be that floor, and that he would be the one to kind of disprove the rule. So in the past 100 years, these models have accurately predicted the actual presidential winner in all but 3 elections. One that was wrong was Al Gore, and he won the popular vote, so maybe that's not necessarily fair.
As did Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, so it's very, very close. Now, based on those models, we would predict a Republican to win. But once again, we think, how is it possible for someone like Donald Trump to win, to your point, that has a fairly narrow base that seems to be getting narrower, that's very, very committed and loyal to him, but that base is narrower? than it used to be. So how does he win? And that's really hard to say. Now, one reason why he might be able to would be that those states that are these competitive, important swing states do seem to have more of the Obama-Trump voter than the Clinton or than the Romney to Clinton voter, like the demographics of those particular states. So just the way the electoral map shapes out might give him that advantage. But I think a lot of people just think it's hard to imagine how he could win again. And one more thing I'll say is this, is some people might say that in 2016, Trump didn't win, but Hillary Clinton lost. And that was because the base fell out. Now, if you look at the number of votes that Trump received in various states like Wisconsin and other blue wall states, he got fewer votes than Romney, I think it was, in Wisconsin. Romney would have won Wisconsin if Obama only got the votes that Hillary won. So I think the question might be, rather than asking what might Trump do in 2020, it's who are the Democrats going to nominate? And are they going to be able to nominate a candidate that inspires voters more like Barack Obama did, or a candidate like Hillary Clinton that wasn't able to pull the coalition together?
We can only have one moderator at a time here. Now, I want to get to that question in a second, but I guess let me phrase this another way. If you were advising Trump, what would you advise him, or is he so locked into the base strategy that it's too late for him to try and make a play for a broader electorate?
I don't know how he backtracks. I think that identity politics is something that gets people really excited, gets people really riled up, and I think often benefits Donald Trump. But I don't think that that's a good thing for people to be riled up about.
Well, let's talk about the 2020 picture. There are a few people running, or apparently running. We don't have time to mention them all. So why don't you guys give your top 10?
Top 10. You want to start, Ron?
Well, look, I mean, I think that it's hard to know where to sort all this out. I do think that if they run, Vice President Biden, Senator Sanders, Senator Warren are kind of in a tier by themselves. They're very, very well known. They start with significant support. And kind of everyone else in the Democratic Party is trying to get to that same place. We don't know if 1, 2, 3, or 0 of those 3 people will run. And so I think it's hard to predict. To me, it's the race that most reminds me of in some ways is 1988, where we had a very, very, very large field of people who are really kind of now luminaries in the Democratic Party. That field included Al Gore, Jesse Jackson, Richard Gephardt, Mike Dukakis. I'm sure I'm forgetting other people. And we called them the Paul Simon.
Yes.
And we, I think I said Gephardt, but we called him Gary Hart. Oh yeah, briefly, Gary Hart. You know, and the point.
Any others? Do we hear?
Yeah, and the point I want to make about this is we called them the Seven Dwarfs. That's what they were called because they were just seen as like a bunch of people all running, and no one knew who any of them were, and so on and so forth. So you look at this field now, you see a lot of candidates. They kind of seem unknown. They kind of seem like small figures. How will they beat Trump? And yet, you know, I think we will look back and see several of these people are going to be real giants in our party, and one of them, I think, will be the next president of the United States.
I've never felt the need for a campaign more than now, Doug. It seems to me, I don't have this sense of anxiety that, gee, there isn't an obvious candidate. Now, that's what campaigns are for. But having said that, what are the qualities that you think are the most saleable qualities for a Democrat in 2020?
Authenticity. I think authenticity is very important. I think being able to connect with voters, and then having a message that is powerful, that is aspirational, that resonates with voters. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier in the green room. I mean, you have to know why you're running, you know, and you have to know why you're going to make this sacrifice, because spending 12 hours a day in Iowa, campaigning across that state, and then flying to New Hampshire, it takes a lot out of you. And I think to your point about why I want to see this is because I want to see these folks go through that. Like, I want to see them tested
Yeah.
through the rigors of a primary. because the general election is going to be hard. And I think that we'll likely have, we could have 20 people running. I mean, but I do think that the being comfortable in yourself is so important when you're running for office.
Yeah.
Because voters can see through phoniness. And you can have all the best economic and foreign policy ideas, but if they think you're phony, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, well, you know what George Burns said about show business, all you need is sincerity to succeed, and if you can fake that, you've got it made. So, but I do think authenticity is a leading indicator in presidential candidates, and in terms of the need for a candidate to prove themselves over the course of the campaign. Anita Dunn sitting over here, who had quite a bit to do with the Obama campaign in 2008 and played a central role, and she remembers that we went through all 50 primaries, which were a proving ground for him. I think having endured those against Hillary Clinton, who was a very skilled candidate and the presumptive frontrunner going in, made him a more formidable figure, to Ron's point. So I got the signal a while ago. I blew right through it to go to questions from the audience, and they're many and they're numerous. And I apologize in advance for those who didn't make the cut. Wasn't an editorial judgment. In the past dozen years, the Democrats have turned Virginia and Colorado from red to blue states. What do the Democrats have to do to turn more red states blue to defeat Trump in 2020? I don't care, anybody. Anybody can jump in here.
Well, look, I think part of it is...
And by the way, before you do, I should note that you guys got through the 2020 question. Neither of you offering even one name, which proves how skilled you are at the art of politics. But go ahead.
So I think, first of all, candidates matter. I think we saw in Texas, I think we saw in Georgia that they had some really, even though they didn't win, they had two very good candidates. And what that allowed for is for the party in those states to grow and infrastructure to be built and for there to be resources so that so that the party in Texas and in Georgia and other places, you can start having local victories so that you have a pipeline of people who can run for governor, who can run for, state auditor, who can run for secretary of state. Because, the more we elect people at the local level, they begin to aspire for higher office and they get more competitive. And so, look, there's some states that are just very hard, and Mississippi and Alabama are hard places, but I do think it starts with growing the party sort of at the grassroots level.
Anybody?
Well,
you mentioned Arizona before, so you've identified one.
But I also think, look, some of this is just about doing our political mechanics better. Georgia was a blue state in 2018 if voters hadn't been illegally suppressed, if voting machines had been properly deployed, if voting lines had been cut down, if the Supreme Court hadn't, in Shelby County versus Holder, reversed the Voting Rights Act and allowed Brian Kemp to basically single-handedly, suppress thousands of votes. Same thing in Florida. And so I think, I think our party is doing better each time on some of this, but we got to do much better still in 2020 on making sure our voters get registered, they stay on the rolls once they're registered, they get to the polls, they're allowed to vote without waiting in line 3 hours, and their votes are actually tabulated. And I think if we do that, a lot of these states that look red will be blue.
On that point, and this is not true in the states that we've mentioned, but how much of a difference does it make, based on your experience, to have a governor of your own party in control of the mechanism in a state? Because now you have a Democratic governor and Secretary of State in Michigan. You have a Democratic governor in Wisconsin, two states.
And Pennsylvania also.
Pennsylvania Pennsylvania also, right. So tell me what you think, what difference does this make for 2020?
Huge. If you ask me the single thing, most important thing for us winning in 2020 that happened in 2018 was taking the state houses in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan and significantly lowering the risk that all kinds of electoral malfeasance and misconduct will keep us from winning those states in 2020. Makes a big difference. Again, and I say this not because I think it's a good thing. I think it's a horrible thing. I think our electoral systems in all 50 states ought to be run by neutral people who who are not in either political party, and if if the Republicans can get more actual human beings to get registered and vote, then they should win these elections. But conversely, if Democrats can do it, we should win these elections, and it shouldn't turn on this ridiculous political gamesmanship in how we run elections in America. That's just wrong, but it is our system, and I'm glad we have Democrats in those 3 states next time.
Emily, one question here is probably best addressed to you. Given the 2018 midterm results, can each of you make an educated guesstimate what Republican candidate for president is most likely to prevail in general election, Trump or someone else? It's an interesting theoretical question. Would Democrats have a better chance? Would Republicans have a better chance without Trump? And let me add an amendment to it, which is, do you anticipate that there'll be a primary challenge to Trump?
I don't anticipate that there would be, and I think it probably wouldn't go well for a Republican that challenged him for the reason I mentioned earlier, that Republicans seem to punish Republicans that they view as betraying a member of the group, which is a little odd given that Trump wasn't a Republican until, when? Like 5 years ago or something. But people seem to really punish those who don't support him.
But what if someone were to run for the express purpose of challenging him, knowing that they weren't going to win the nomination? You've heard Senator Flake's name mentioned. Governor Kasich has talked about running. And what would the impact, and I open this up to all of you, of all on Trump's electability in November, because the history of this is presidential candidates who have presidents who have primary challenges within their own party have been wounded in the past.
Look, I think it would definitely hurt Trump. I think that he would definitely find the pressure of a primary opponent distracting. I think it would help the Democrats a bit because instead of spending all the time attacking our candidates, he'd have to deal with his own primary. But I think, I kind of agree with Emily on this, and I'll go even a step further. I think Donald Trump will get between 45 and 46% of the general election popular vote in 2020. Like right now, I'll say that and bet money on that. And so the question will be, will that be a number?
You haven't been talking to the Russians, have you?
Yeah. No, the question is will that be a number that allows him to win or lose, right? And that turns in part on what third-party candidates, this is it always seems like an excuse, but it really is a real factor, what third-party candidates run and what percentage of the vote they get. And, we should never forget that, given a different third-party situation, Hillary Clinton probably would have won Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan.
Yes.
And so, so the point of that with regard to the primary is, it kind of depends if, we're looking at a very different election in 2020. If John Kasich runs in the primaries and loses to Donald Trump and then is barred from running in most states under sore loser laws unless he can get those struck down, or if he runs as an independent and peels off 10% of the electorate and 45% becomes a big winning number in the general election. So I think this third party thing, which seems like it's kind of esoteric, may well be the most decisive factor in whether or not Trump
wouldn't
gets
you
elected.
encourage that?
I think if you were Trump, you would encourage that. You'd say to Kasich, do it or whatever, however you would double, triple, reverse psychology Kasich into doing it. I don't know,
Well,
but
Bloomberg,
that's what you do. Bloomberg, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that Bloomberg has committed himself to the Democratic candidates this year, and he clearly has done the math on this, and I don't think he's going to do it for the exercise. So if he runs, it'll be, I suspect, on the Democratic side. Did you want to jump in on
Yeah,
that?
I was just going to say, I think Trump would love to have a primary opponent because I think he just loves to campaign. And if I recall, I think
How does he find the time to do it all? That's what I want to know.
I think if he could start campaigning for the presidency tomorrow, he would, and I would not be surprised if he does start to do more formal presidential campaign-oriented rallies. President Obama announced his reelection in April, April of 2011. I think Trump is going to be out there as soon as possible because that's his comfort zone. He doesn't like what's going on here. He doesn't do well with the mechanics of Washington. He wants to be out in the field, and I think if he has to, even better if he has a foil.
Well, yes, and I think and we should point out that it's hard to measure a candidate when you don't know who the other candidate is, and he is masterful at finding the precise pressure points on his opponents and just hammering away at them. And if he can make his opponent as unacceptable as he is and drive them to that third-party candidate, that's a prescription for victory. But there are certain externalities that he doesn't have entire control over. So let me ask this question. Mueller and the impact of his report, assuming it's as damning as per Dershowitz, but not criminal, what is the likely impact of that on the electorate in 2020?
I can speak a little bit to this. So I did a typology of Trump voters from 2016 and identified about 5 different groups of Trump voters. And what's really important about this is a lot of people think that if people voted for Trump, they must have done it for the same reason, and they're all the same kinds of people. That's an unwise way to look at the electorate. I'm sure you know very well that any coalition it's groups of different types of people, right? And they have different interests and needs. And that there's one group in particular that was really crucial to the Trump win in 2016. And for them, we labeled them anti-elites. They really don't like the idea that there's this class of people that kind of are above everybody else and they get special treatment. And because at the time, they viewed Hillary Clinton more in this category than they did Trump. But if you ask them about the Mueller investigation, they're the most likely to say if it turns up something significant, this would be a game changer for them. So they would punish Trump if they found out if they found a smoking gun. Where there are other parts of the Trump coalition where he could just do anything and they probably wouldn't punish him. So I think this investigation will be very important for that. It was about 20% of his voters. It would be very important for them.
But what if they find a smoking gun and Trump tells his supporters that gun isn't smoking? Will they accept that?
Some of them will. Some of them will believe what he says, but there's others that I think are getting a little exhausted.
Okay. I think the Mueller thing has one other implication. I don't think the Mueller thing is going to move the needle that much for Trump one way or the other. It makes me sad to say that, but I kind of believe that. But I do think it has one other implication. I think as the Mueller investigation unfolded in the back half of 2017, it had the impact, I think, of depressing Republican candidate recruitment and encouraging a lot of Democrats to run for office. I think it had a psychological impact on a bunch of Republicans retired. They had very high levels of retirements. A bunch of great Democratic candidates ran. And I think, again, we won a lot of these House races because of that. So I think the cloud that hangs over Trump's head may not change the minds of most Trump voters, maybe some, Emily, but most Trump voters. But I do think it does somewhat depress people wanting to run as Republicans and somewhat encourage Democrats who want to run as Democrats.
Let's talk about the dynamics of this new Democratic House. And I don't know how much, Bob, you got into this in your discussion, but you wrote an interesting piece right after the election, and you advised Democrats not to send a blizzard of subpoenas down Pennsylvania Avenue in the first 100 days, but rather concentrate on those issues that Doug notes they ran on. If the Mueller report comes out anytime soon, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Democrats to act on it. And there are myriad other issues that are hanging out there that actually warrant congressional oversight. And I ask both of you guys this question as Democrats. How do Democrats navigate that? And Emily, I ask you, what opportunity is there for Trump if the perception is that he's being pummeled by this new Democratic House?
Well, look, I worked for 2 Democratic presidents who got reelected, in some part because people believed that the Republican Party was more obsessed with destroying their presidency than in delivering for the American people. And I think it'd be a mistake if the Democrats fall into that same trap. I mean, I listen to Democrats talk like they are reading Trey Gowdy's playbook as if it was the playbook to follow, when it's like a playbook that should be burned and never followed again. It did not work. And so for Republicans, so I think that Democrats ran. Go back to something Doug said about all the ads, the 300,000 ads. Those ads weren't about Mueller. They weren't about Ryan Zinke. They weren't about Anthony. They weren't about Secretary Acosta. They were largely about health care, jobs, child care, the bread and butter issues. And so I think it's very important for the new Democratic majority to start on a foot of delivering on those issues, of delivering on raising the minimum wage, patching up the parts of the Affordable Care Act that Trump has punctured holes in, doing something about overtime pay, doing something about child care, and all these basic issues, and showing folks that's what they're for. And also, I think it's important for Democrats in the first 100 days to pass a clean Dreamers bill and force Trump to either sign or veto it, force the Senate to pass or veto it, and do something on voting rights as well. They need to be out front on these bread and butter issues. Of course they should do oversight. Of course they should follow up on whatever Mueller does. They're in charge for 2 years. They have plenty of time to do that. They ought to start with the bread and butter stuff first and let that stuff follow
As
later.
a political matter, it also forces the Senate to act on these things.
Forces the Senate to act on those things.
I assume you don't want rebuttal time on this, but give me your thoughts on it.
I mean, I agree with what Ron said. 40, we won 40 seats. So, and those, and every one of those Democrats won on a message that was basically either health care, wages, or just taking care of kitchen table issues, right? If you look at all their advertising, that's really what they won on. And there's going to be pressure from those 40 members on the new Democratic leadership to follow through on a lot of the promises that they made on the campaign trail, because these folks have to go home every weekend and talk to their constituents on what they're getting done. And so, look, there can be responsible oversight being done by the different committees in the House, and there should be, because God knows it wasn't being done under the Republicans. But if Democrats lose track of what won them the House, and what are the issues that are animating voters, then we're going to have a tough 2020. And so I would encourage them to try to keep their eye on the ball. Don't fall for the shiny objects. If there's something to pursue with the Mueller report, absolutely pursue it. If there are other things to look at in terms of oversight, absolutely. But overall, the party's message has to be focused on how am I going to make this person's life better?
Yeah, Emily, a lot of the Republican campaigns sort of focused on this notion that Democrats will be a crazy left-wing band of marauders who are coming after Trump every day instead of doing the people's business. How promising a storyline is that for Trump?
Well, okay, a couple of things. I agree with what Ron and Doug have said. I think that for Democrats to focus on the issues, all along, that's been what Democrats should focus on to kind of deal with Trump. Trump does better when he looks like the victim. And I think one thing we have to remember is that the average voter out there doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about politics.
Right.
They really don't. And so if what they see is Trump appearing to no longer be the person making the offensive comments and saying the outrageous things, but instead being the victim of a Democratic-controlled House, that's going to change the dynamic quite a bit. And so some evidence that I would put forth for this is what we saw with the midterms. So again, I work at the Cato Institute. We're nonpartisan, so I'm not advocating for either political party. Talking to political consultants who worked on the campaigns, what they told me was that going into the midterms, things weren't looking good for Republicans until the middle of September with the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, because Republicans and Democrats viewed the hearings through different lenses. Now, I know we don't all agree here, but I'm just telling you what they saw in the numbers. Republicans and Democrats saw the Kavanaugh hearings very differently. And what they did is they took the attention away from the latest Trump tweet, and it was focused on how Democrats were handling the confirmation hearings. So Democrats saw it as protecting a victim, and Republicans saw it as a matter of fairness. And they felt like Democrats were jettisoning fairness and due process. And that got them very upset, more upset than I think a lot of Democrats realized. So when that happened, the numbers started shifting in the Republicans' favor. Okay, then he's confirmed. Then it shifted. Trump took over the narrative again. He's talking about the migrant caravan. There was that outrageous commercial that came out that Fox wouldn't air. And all of a sudden, Trump is talking about immigration again. And then it tanked in the suburbs. So this is the storyline that a lot of political consultants on the Republican side will tell
It's
you.
a pretty good storyline.
And you could see how this could play in two different ways for 2020.
Yeah, because one thing about Trump is he does play the victim well. And much like in sports where one player grabs the other player, pulls him down, and then calls for a foul because he was tackled, he draws people in a way.
Yeah, and I'd add one other thing to that, which is, and we saw this in 2015 and 2016 on both. This is an observation we came to in the Clinton campaign before we debated Trump. You watched all these debates of Republicans going after Trump, and it was this amazing paradox. The things where you think Trump would be most vulnerable on, his horrible business practices, his lying, his corruption, so on and so forth, he was strongest on because he actually knew what he was talking about in those areas. He knew, who built Trump Tower, how many undocumented workers did it, and what his answer on that is. He knew who he employed at Mar-a-Lago. Like, he is on solid ground discussing his own corruption because he is familiar with it. He's actually on much weaker ground talking about policy issues. And while you might think it's hard to go after him on the policy stuff, actually it was much easier because he couldn't really handle it. His worst moment in a Republican debate was when Ted Cruz kind of nailed him on his position that he had been for universal health care, and he couldn't really figure out what health care position he was on, so on and so forth. So I do think that if the Democrats can keep it on these policy issues, I think they will actually, ironically, have more success barbecuing Trump on that than they will on the things that you think should really be able to get to Trump.
Barbecue Trump doesn't sound that tasty to me.
Fair enough.
How do you, as you guys point out, a lot of the people who won, I mean, there was the other Republican meme was that the Congress was going to move and the party was going to move very far left. Most of the candidates who won and are going to Congress now actually come from swing districts and are more moderate. And you saw already compromises that Nancy Pelosi had to make with the Problem Solvers Caucus to try and secure her victory. That may make it easier to get bipartisan legislation on the floor and so on. But a presidential race, in a presidential race, the temptation is going to be to out anti-Trump each other. And Doug, first of all, if you were advising a presidential campaign, a candidate trying to get the nomination, not trying to win the election, but get the nomination, is that a plausible strategy that you want to be the most vigorous anti-Trumper in the group?
I don't think that's going to win. I don't think that'll win the nomination. I think, again, it would go back. I think that the Democrat who emerges is going to have to be the one who has a vision. And I think you're going to have a whole bunch of people run who don't really have a vision for this country. They want to run because, for whatever reason, they just want to. They want to be president. But we've certainly seen a number of candidates over the years who run, but they don't have a real vision for the country. They don't have a real story to tell the American people on where they're going to take this country. Say what you want about Trump. What he had was a story, and he had good guys and bad guys. And it's pretty simple. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into running a presidential campaign, but at the end of the day, you've got to have a story to tell the American people. You've got to have a problem that you're going to solve, and the reason why you can solve it. And so, I think that being the most anti-Trump or trying to get to the left of Sanders, I just think that's a fool's errand. I think you've got to have, I think at the end of the day, you're going to have a vision that you buy into, that you believe, and then you just double down on it and run.
And let me just add my own view to that, which is that I think that people are not going to be looking for more rancor. They're not going to be looking for more acrimony. I think there's a lot of exhaustion, and I think that if someone steps forward who's tough enough to deal with Trump, but represents a different approach, you're likely to do better even with Democratic voters. I have to, before we go, and I'm not going to look at the timekeeper because I know I'm getting the hook, and I'm the only one standing between everybody and the reception. But I have to ask you about technology and politics. You're involved in a...
I'm going to be the one standing if you go over.
Exactly. But you work with a startup that is incubating projects in technology, mostly, on the Democratic side. The Obama campaign was noteworthy for its innovation in technology and bringing new technology to politics. You've been pioneering various projects. So tell me how that worked out in 2018 and just how that might shape what we're going to see in 2020.
Yeah, it is the case that the Obama campaign in 2008 was the most technologically advanced campaign in American history. 2012, a little less so. And frankly, let's be honest, in 2016, in many ways, the Trump campaign was more technologically advanced than the Clinton campaign. We had lost our edge. And I think that was one problem. I think a second big problem we had among Democrats was almost all of our technological innovation was at the presidential level. We had great people from Silicon Valley helping our presidential campaigns, but our state, local races, even our congressional races, were being run on very, very old tech. So a bunch of veterans of the Obama campaigns came together after 2016, and we founded something called Higher Ground Labs. We raised a couple $1 million, and we invested in 23 promising startups that had new technology for political campaigns and for progressive causes on the Democratic side. And these include things like Let's Mobilize, which is a simple app that campaigns could use to identify volunteers and to sort them and put them into shifts. Voter Circle, which allowed voters to contact other voters digitally, to send emails to voters in swing districts. Change Polls, which replaced traditional polling with an internet-based polling model. It's 10% of the cost and much faster, and a bunch of other innovations. And we, as I said, backed 23 of these companies. 12 of them had product in the field in 2018. Many of them played very significant roles in swing races. They played a big role. We had 5 or 6 of them in 2017 in Virginia, and the DNC said 3 of them were really instrumental in our tremendous success in Virginia in 2017. We're going to go back at it and fund a bunch more companies in advance of 2020 in an effort to really, what we've seen is this tremendous amount of grassroots energy, and turning that energy into effective work for campaigns, into voters, and to get out the vote, and to digital contacts and all these things. That's a technology issue, and we're trying to innovate and find a way to do that that's not only effective, but affordable for down-ballot races too, that state legislative candidates can use, the candidates for city council can use, that aren't just big, expensive enterprise solutions, which is what the presidential campaigns do.
So if any of you have good ideas, Ron has deep pockets. He'll be right here
Send
in
them
the
my way, you bet.
front of the room. I apologize to all of you who sent in questions that I haven't been able to use, even those who sent in 3 pretending that you were different people. But it's been a very rich discussion. I thank you, Ron and Emily and Doug, and it's good to be with you. And we'll be hopefully invited back in 2 years to deny everything that we said today. So, thank you.
Well done, and if you'll wait for just a second, I guess I'm going to put my body between us and the reception. But I do want to thank this panel, the previous panel, and our keynote speaker, Henry Olson. I want to thank the people from NYU DC who have made an effort to make you all comfortable and accommodate you, and in particular, Sue Anderson, who I don't see here, but she's in the dean's office in New York and was just invaluable in helping Bob and me put this together. And lastly, I want to thank the audience because you were wonderful. The questions were, I was reading them all, and it was impossible to rank them because they were all so very good. You were also engaged. We appreciate very much your coming. And now there is a reception upstairs, and you can have some wine and cheese and other goodies. But thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
You can stand up if you would, yeah.
You need a pin.
Yeah, the tree falls before us, you know?